A lone rider pushes his horse through the cold spring night as the lanterns of the first town came slowly into view. Once nearing earshot of his fellow patriots, the horseman begins to yell, "The British are coming." As the eyes of the rebels opened, the sound of the midnight rider's hooves trail off along with his repeated and ominous warning. As many of you know, this is the midnight ride of one of America's larger-than-life founding fathers, the renowned Paul Revere. While Revere did go on a midnight ride to warn the citizens of Massachusetts of an approaching British army, the tale known in the popular imagination of most Americans is one of a 19th century invention from the famous poet, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, and his story, Paul Revere's Ride. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere on the 18th of April in 75. Hardly a man is now alive who remembers that day and year. Longfellow's fictitious representation of Paul Revere is exactly something that would have seemed more like an invention of Revere himself. As we will come to see, the master of early revolutionary propaganda would be overrepresented, and fittingly, he would be immortalized. But his impact was not as Longfellow would make us believe. For the sake of true legacy, I would like to uncover the man behind the midnight ride, and the propagandist hiding behind the veil of one of America's most celebrated founding fathers. Paul Revere was born in the British Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1735. More specifically, he was from Boston, a city where he would spend most of his life. His mother was a Bostonian native named Deborah Hitchborn, whose family owned and operated some of the many docks crisscrossing Boston Harbor. The Revere patriarch was a French immigrant named Apollos Rivard, who would later anglicize his name to Paul Revere, making him Paul Revere Sr. Kinda. For the sake of avoiding confusion, we will refer to him as Apollos. Like many who immigrated to the Americas, the French-born Apollos brought his trade along with him, opening and operating a silver shop storefront along with a forge, to craft the valuable metal into even more profit. The 6-year-old Paul Revere started going to school in 1741, where he would receive a basic education for 7 years, until dropping out to train under his father as a silversmith apprentice. The early days of a young silversmith would see the apprentice progressively create more intricate works of metallurgy. First were plain plates, then bowls, cups, mugs, and after that it was on to cutlery, jewelry, and then finally it was time to engrave the silver into works of unique and unreplaceable art. With his father's tutelage, Paul Revere became a great silversmith in his own right, but not yet a silver master when his father unexpectedly died in 1754. This left the Revere family without their main source of income. The silver shop could not stay open without its master, forcing the Revere family to partner with one of Apollos's previous apprentices just to keep the family business going. The Revere family were still in good hands, and the money still flowed in, just less so now. 2 years after his father's death, Paul Revere decided to join the military. A military whose presence he would one day warn of: the British Army. The French and Indian War, known as the 7 Years' War in Europe, was already in full sway thanks to a British officer named George Washington. Paul was immediately promoted to second lieutenant in an artillery regiment, thanks to his expansive knowledge of metallurgy. We can assume, based on later actions and on his short stint as a soldier, that he did not enjoy his time in the military. A year after signing in 1757, Lieutenant Paul retired from the army, married a woman named Sarah Orne, had his first of 16 children, became a master silversmith, and finally became the head of the family business. In this spot, Paul would remain for most of his early adult years, growing his family and becoming ever more present in the community of Boston. By 1763, the French and Indian War came to an end. The treaty that followed would come to have long-lasting impacts on the otherwise victorious British Empire. While the British had just severely weakened the French hold on North America, they had simultaneously handed more of that power to the Native Americans. A line was quite literally drawn in the sand between the American colonists and the many tribes in the West, barring anyone from settling anywhere in Indian lands without explicit British permission. This, of course, angered the colonists, who got all the way to America just to not exploit the bountiful and seemingly endless West. Manifest destiny in tow, the colonists quite literally crossed the line for the first time, and far from the last. An added and more serious point of anger for the American colonists was the monetary effects of the 1763 Treaty of Paris. Up until this point, the American colonies had gotten off pretty easy as far as wide-scale taxing was concerned. They were getting extorted, sure, but no more than an Englishman at the time and less than an Irishman. To help pay for the war that George Washington had dragged the empire into, Parliament began taxing the colonies. The first set of taxes were frowned upon, but didn't stir the outrage that the 1765 Stamp Act caused. Everything that came in and out of the American colonies had to have a British stamp on it, leaving Paul's maternal side of the family on the forefront of this tax, as they owned many of Boston Harbor's shipping and receiving docks. The Stamp Act was a way for easy income to flow into London, but it had the opposite effect as less exports and imports came in and out of the 13 colonies. Smuggling goods also became a lucrative black market. This in turn caused an economic depression, and as the colonial banks began to foreclose, they attempted to seize Paul Revere's silver shop. He somehow managed to keep the banks at bay, but only by taking up part-time work as a dentist. Paul Revere, like many other Bostonians, was personally hurt by the Stamp Act in multiple ways. As anti-British sentiment grew in the city, Paul saw many of his compatriots join the Sons of Liberty, an organization of like-minded colonists who made their anger at the British Empire heard through public demonstration and various forms of disobedience. In the Sons of Liberty, Paul Revere would brush shoulders with the likes of John Adams, John Hancock, and many other signers of the Declaration of Independence, with Samuel Adams becoming the de facto leader and demagogue of this underground society. His voice started to carry over all of Boston. While his voice did reach far, it had its limits. Words and writing did not, prompting the anti-British propaganda campaign that would continuously pour out of Boston Harbor. Paul Revere's skills as a silversmith would lead him to become one of the leading propaganda agents in the Sons of Liberty, engraving on metal or drawing on paper images of British tyranny and a call for action from his fellow colonists. Some of Paul's works of propaganda during this time included Join or Die Wyvern, opposed to the commonly seen snake, American colonists quite literally being fed poison by the British, domineering British warships docked in the port of Boston, a certain cabinet of politicians taxing without representing, a stark sight of a man hanging dead from the Liberty Tree, as well as a particularly disturbing call to action where the governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony is being attacked by the Grim Reaper. In 1767, the British pressed even more regulations onto their American colonies, with the Townshend Acts. The biggest of these 5 new laws was the words that every colonist feared. The British could now legally tax the colonies without consent and without mercy if willing. The Sons of Liberty grew in number with every tax and every British soldier allowed to quarter in a Bostonian home. On a cold night in 1770, the spark that lit the revolutionary sentiment in Boston was ignited. An argument between British guards and colonial citizens turned into yelling, and eventually the Bostonians began a riotous snowball fight. After one soldier lost his balance, he regained his footing and shot into the crowd, causing many of the other soldiers to fire in unison, killing 5 and hitting another 6. The mob of up to 300 dispersed, but they never forgot. This event, known thereafter as the Boston Massacre, would see Paul Revere create perhaps the most famous piece of early revolutionary propaganda. The silver engraving, although it says engraved, printed, and sold by Paul Revere, is actually a work of collaboration with 3 other men. Revere was likely given the credit for this piece due to his already established reputation among many Bostonians. 3 years later, and it was time for a tea party. The British colonies in India produced too much tea, so the British passed an act that would sell this near-expiring tea to the American colonists for a heavily discounted price. Despite doing the opposite of taxation, the Bostonians were furious at Parliament. The Sons of Liberty, among others, organized the Boston Tea Party, which would see hundreds of pounds of tea dumped into the harbor. Paul Revere acted as one of the watchmen during this escapade. His family also might have had a hand in organizing the whole endeavor, as they owned some of Boston's many shipping docks and had numerous connections in the port. As Moore opposed the British, professional organizations of colonists began committees of safety, inspection, and correspondence to keep the British in check. Paul Revere would serve as one of the many couriers in the Committee of Public Safety. Basically, he was in the spy network. From 1773 to 1775, Paul Revere recorded 18 trips from New York to Philadelphia. Underground American newspapers began talking about the rugged Revere, endlessly on the inner city road. In December of 1774, Paul Revere would go on a delivery that may have had more impact than his midnight ride. In response to colonial plotting, the British began to seize their gunpowder stores located all over the 13 colonies, so they would not fall into American hands. Revere would ride from Boston all the way to Portsmouth, informing the locals that the British would seize the gunpowder stored in the nearby Fort William and Mary. This prompted the local Minutemen to raid the fort and steal its gunpowder, guaranteeing the firepower of the imminent revolution. In early April of 1775, Paul Revere would alert the North Church of Boston. The Redcoats were making their move to seize the gunpowder stored further inland at Lexington and Concord. 1 lantern in the steeple if the British passed by land, 2 lanterns if they crossed the Charles River. That night, the colonists' worst fears were realized. The best navy in the world were going to cross Boston Bay. The moment we have all been waiting for is about to transpire. Paul Revere crossed the Charles River, slipping by the British and arriving on the other side before the Redcoats even left. Contrary to popular belief, Paul Revere was not the only rider that night, but one of dozens. Paul Revere just so happened to be one of 2 men who got the first and arguably most important signal from Boston. The man joining Revere for the first leg of his midnight ride was named William Dawes, and instead of taking ferry across the Charles River, Dawes took the southern land route through the Boston Neck. With Revere alerting the militia to the north and Dawes doing the same in the south, the whole countryside of Massachusetts was awoken. But not by the infamous line that Paul Revere is so famous for. He never said the British are coming, and he didn't yell through the streets. Only an idiot spy would scream top-secret information on enemy troop movements. Instead, Revere and Dawes would knock on the door of key informants who would alert the other collaborators in the town and send out their own midnight riders. This legend about the midnight ride is again thanks to our friend and poet, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Near Mystic Lake, the 2 riders found each other and rode hard toward their main mission, the town of Lexington. Here, the faces of the Sons of Liberty, Sam Adams and John Hancock, laid in hiding from the British. Upon reaching the first checkpoint at Lexington, the riders took a short break, and thank God they did. At the strange hour of 1 a.m., the local doctor and revolutionary, Samuel Prescott, arrived at Hancock's house after visiting a female friend. Soon after, the 3 riders left Lexington for the last leg of their journey. the gunpowder stores of Concord. They got about halfway before they were suddenly forced to stop. The British had set up a roadblock and the Midnight Riders had failed to see it until they were nearly upon it. The three men tried to escape and, in a panic, Paul Revere was captured. But this may have allowed for the other two riders to get away. William Dawes reared his horse around and made way back to Lexington before falling off his horse after a few miles. In no condition to ride any further, Dawes concluded his midnight ride. Dr. Prescott, on the other hand, jumped a fence and circumvented the roadblock. He continued for Concord and managed to reach his destination. Just think, if Samuel Prescott wasn't horny that night, then who knows if Concord and the rebellion, for that matter, even succeed. Revere was interrogated by his captors, but as all good spies do, he told the British that they were too late. And he was right. After taking Revere's horse, he was freed. He had to walk all the way back to Hancock and Adams, but he was still alive and the mission to alert the countryside had been completed. Revere got back in Lexington just in time to help Hancock flee before the battle for the town square started. Concord and Lexington were only the start of the revolution. Revere did much of the same spy work and currying for the American cause over the course of the next year. During this time, the inappropriately named Battle of Bunker Hill, which actually occurred on Breed's Hill, would break out. Here, Paul Revere's close friend, General Joseph Warren, would succumb to British bullets. In remembrance of his friend and all those who gave their life that day, Revere created a new piece of propaganda. This engraving showed Boston Harbor filled with British warships bombarding and attacking the city of Charlestown, which was consumed by flames. By 1776, with the Revolution in full swing, Revere became a major in the infantry, and for the next 2 years he would guard the city of Boston as the third in command, where he, his friends, and his family all called home. In the summer of 1779, Paul Revere would face the worst defeat of his short military career. The so-called Penobscot expedition would see America's first armada, consisting of 44 newly built ships, be outclassed by the British Navy. Revere didn't command any boats, instead an artillery detachment of Marines. Regardless, the Americans were defeated with ease, Revere hardly seeing any action firsthand. While he couldn't be blamed for the Penobscot disaster, he was still court-martialed for poor military conduct and therefore kicked out of the army. This is the part of Paul Revere's story that is never talked about, and that's exactly how this master of American propaganda would have wanted it. Later in 1782, Revere's court-martial was lifted. But with the revolution coming to an end, he didn't re-enlist. It should be noted that the main leader of this expedition shared a name with our midnight riding poet, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. His name was General Peleg Wadsworth. Following the war, Paul Revere became a very successful industrial businessman. Of course with silver, but also cast iron, among other metals. Revere was part of the American Revolution as well as the Industrial Revolution. He would be one of the first to produce the American way, which basically meant that everything was standardized and something broken could be fixed by casting the same exact part to repair that item. Revere became very wealthy off of this, and even went into politics as he grew older, although he never had much success on that front. On May 10th of 1818, Paul Revere would pass away in the city of Boston that he had gave so much to. After his death, his name was largely forgotten. That is, until 1860, when Henry Wadsworth Longfellow revived this founding father and created a folk hero that nearly every American has at least heard of. The truth behind America's first propagandist was that he helped rile up the city of Boston and many others to support the revolutionary cause. If the media and commoners never see the Boston Massacre or his many other pieces of propaganda, then maybe the revolution never even happens. Although the Midnight Ride wasn't as epic as Longfellow would have you believe, Revere should still be celebrated for his bravery in the dark and behind his pen. If Sam Adams could win over crowds with his booming voice, Paul could do the same without whispering a single word. He was the founding father of propaganda, showing the colonists the tyranny of the British firsthand, proving that the pen, or engraving tool in this case, is much mightier than the sword. If you'd like to support this stoic historian, feel free to do so on Patreon for as little as $1 a month, and join Derek Clark, Savak Leo Nazarian, Taj Guilford, Nick Mate Voician, Lazarus Dykos, and Dave J. Or become a YouTube channel member like Derek Clark again, and Donald Vincent. Thank you guys again for supporting the channel. I really appreciate ya.